Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William Henry Harrison, and the focus is the Briefest Presidency. The year is 1841, and President-elect Harrison shows up in Washington, D.C. on his 68th birthday. It's February the 9th, and he's set to become the oldest president to date in American history, but it seemed like he didn't have a care in the world. At least that's according to his immediate predecessor, Martin Van Buren. After they met at the White House, Van Buren made the statement that he's the most extraordinary man I ever saw. He does not seem to realize the vast importance of his elevation. He talks and thinks with much ease and vivacity. He is as tickled with the presidency as is a young woman with a new bonnet. Well, it turns out that Harrison did have one concern, and it was over his wife, Anna, who was actually quite ill at the time. She was not able to make the trip with him, at least at this point, and in the end, she would be the only First Lady in American history never to step foot in the American Capitol. Well, in terms of his cabinet, Harrison initially reached out to his friend Henry Clay. He wanted him to come back to the cabinet. A former Secretary of State wanted to give him that top spot in the cabinet in his administration, but Clay decided not to accept. Perhaps he didn't want to do it again, or perhaps he didn't want to serve under Harrison because he had kind of wanted the presidency for himself. Or perhaps he thought he could control Harrison, and this way he could actually run the Congress from the Senate and the executive with his influence over Harrison. But for whatever reason, Clay decided not to accept. Instead, Harrison went with Daniel Webster of Massachusetts as his Secretary of State. Well, he was hounded by office seekers during his time in Washington, so he decided to take a little break before the inauguration. He left town to focus on the rest of his picks for the cabinet, focus on his inaugural address, so he headed to Berkeley, the plantation of his youth in Virginia, where he grew up, spent there for a couple of weeks before coming back for Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1841. And it was frigid in Washington on this day. Nevertheless, Harrison rode down Pennsylvania Avenue on his favorite horse, Old Whitey. There were about 50,000 people on hand. And yes, he delivered the longest inaugural address in American history. About 8,000 words. It took an hour and a half. He did it without a hat or a coat, but this is not what killed him. The mythology around Harrison sort of catching cold, giving this long address is not accurate. He was actually perfectly healthy for the next 3 weeks before he did start getting sick and eventually did pass in 31 days. So the clock was already ticking, but this speech was what killed him. Well, there was obviously nothing of note in the Harrison presidency, but he does have this speech, which is warrants spending a little bit of time on. It's actually a really fascinating address. It's purely Jeffersonian in much of its perspective on focusing on the rights of the individual. He also is a lot of rebukes to Andrew Jackson, his immediate predecessor, talks about the role of the federal government and a variety of other elements, so it's worth taking a look, given it's the only remnant we really have of note from Harrison's presidency, to take a look at what he said in this really long inaugural address. The opening was really an homage to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Yes, majority rule is really important, but also we're going to protect certain rights no matter what, even though the majority could potentially come out and try to come against them. The Bill of Rights is important, again, part of these Jeffersonian perspectives that were so much part of William Henry Harrison's ideological point of view. But then he got into the role of government and the different branches and the importance of each branch staying focused on its own part, including his commitment to only serve one term as President of the United States. Harrison said, "It is the part of wisdom for a republic to limit the service of that officer to a period so short as to prevent his forgetting that he is the accountable agent, not the principal, the servant, not the master." He would say, only one term. He also countered Andrew Jackson's assertion that the president was the direct representative of the American people. That is not how William Henry Harrison saw it. Harrison said in his inaugural, "It is preposterous to suppose that a thought could be for a moment have been entertained that the president, placed at the Capitol in the center of the country, could better understand the wants and wishes of the people than their own immediate representatives, who spend a part of every year among them, living with them, often laboring with them, and bound to them by the triple tie of interest, duty, and affection." The balance of power in Washington was shifting under the feet of William Henry Harrison, shifting back to Congress, where it traditionally had been, but it had been taken in a different direction, principally by President Jackson. And Harrison continued. He also, in slight rebukes to Jackson, said he would use the veto sparingly. He would not make wholesale changes. The whole spoil system that Jackson had introduced, that was not going to be the way he was going to run his executive branch. And he really took a shot at Jackson's specie circular, which had had such a devastating effect on the American economy and really dogged the Van Buren administration for 4 years. According to Harrison, the idea of making it currency exclusively metallic, however well intended, appears to be fraught with more fatal consequences than any other scheme having no relation to the personal rights of the citizens that has ever been devised. If there is one measure better calculated than another to produce the state of things of so much deprecated by all true Republicans, by which the rich are daily adding to their hoards and the poor sinking deeper into penury, it is an exclusive metallic currency. He wasn't holding back. He also gave a shout out to the people of Washington, D.C., the first president to acknowledge their rights, even though they were not represented at the time in the federal government. And then he talked about the races. Consistent point of view from William Henry Harrison when it came to slavery, as backed by the Constitution. In his inaugural, he said, "No such nation can long exist without the careful culture of those feelings of confidence and affection which are the effective bonds to union between free and confederated states. The attempt of those of one state to control the domestic institutions of another can only result in feelings of distrust and jealousy, the certain harbingers of disunion, violence, and civil war, and the ultimate destruction of free institutions." This was his consistent belief about slavery. It is lawful where it exists, and no one has the right to tell any of those existing states to terminate that behavior, and he had held this belief throughout his entire political career. He also talked about the other racial aspect in North America, the Indians, who he had been at odds with, but he also had been sympathetic toward. He understood their plight, and he was trying to improve and opting for fairness. He said, "I can conceive of no more sublime spectacle than a rigid adherence to the principles of justice on the part of a powerful nation in its transaction with a weaker and uncivilized people whom circumstances have placed at its disposal." There hopefully would have been no more trail of tears under a William Henry Harrison presidency, although how he would have formulated this more sympathetic approach to the Indians, of course, we would never get to see because he wouldn't live to pursue it. Lastly, in this content-written address, Harrison echoed the founders on the concern over factions and parties. Harrison said that the spirit of party, assuming to be that of liberty, is harsh, vindictive, and intolerant, and totally reckless as to the character of the allies which it brings to the aid of its cause. Beyond that, they become destructive of public virtue, the parent of a spirit antagonist to that of liberty, and eventually its inevitable conqueror. Again, a powerful moment about political connections where Harrison was certainly aligned to the Whigs. He was likely going to pursue a Whig-heavy agenda, but he was also signaling that he was going to maintain some of his independence. This was a powerful address, kind of a new sheriff in town, a very different kind of sheriff, both in terms of ideology and approach, compared to an Andrew Jackson, again, kind of skipping Van Buren, but really going back to Jackson, a very different point of view. They were different as major generals. They would be different as presidents, except Jackson served eight years, and Harrison would only serve 31 days. Well, as for the presidency, of course, there's not much to talk about. Maybe one note of interest is the conflict that Harrison had with Henry Clay. He balked at some of Clay's suggestions on political appointments to the point where at one point Harrison simply came out and said, "Mr. Clay, you forget that I am president." Rather bold moment for Harrison to stake his claim to that title. Well, Henry Clay didn't give up. He kept pushing not only on appointments, but he wanted the president to call into special session. He wanted Congress to come back early to get going on the legislation that he had been wanting for his American system for so long. And once again, Harrison wasn't ready to simply give in to Clay. He wrote back to Clay, "You use the privilege of a friend to lecture me, and I take the same liberty with you. You are too impetuous. Much as I rely upon your judgment, there are others whom I must consult, and in many cases to determine adversely to your decision." Henry Clay at this point decided to go home. He left, he went back to Kentucky basically to sulk. The first sign of illness for William Henry Harrison came on March 25th. He had fatigue. Dr. Thomas Miller was called on the 27th, diagnosing pneumonia and intestinal inflammation. The Treatment at the time was horrific. Induced vomiting, induced diarrhea, suction cups, mustard plasters, opium, a sponge bath with turpentine to try to get rid of the things that were causing Harrison his ailment. None of this worked. The end came just after midnight, April 4th, 1841. His last words, presumably for Vice President John Tyler, were, "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." What might have been a totally different presidency if Harrison had survived compared to Tyler, who was really much more of a Democrat than he was a Whig. All kinds of conflict. We'll talk about that in future episodes. But the Whig program that Harrison was intended to push through was essentially thwarted the day he died 31 days into office. Harrison is basically a presidential footnote. He is a blip. Gave an interesting speech, but really nothing more. But his life was so much more than this. He was a true American pioneer. He was a leader in the winning of the West. He was an extremely popular governor, an extremely popular general who was victorious. He changed presidential campaigns forever, and his life represents a segment of early American history that is worth remembering, even if his presidency barely even got started. That is William Henry Harrison and the Briefest Presidency. From the life of William Henry Harrison. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.